Alrighty. We are on to the combat service section. And we all know that the 506 did take part of combat action against Japan, but just for other viewers, did you take part in any combat action? If so, when, where, and against whom?
The only combat action I was in from basically from D-Day in Normandy to Berchtesgaden when the war ended. I was right in Berchtesgaden, Hitler's Eagle's Nest town, that when it all ended.
What were your thoughts and experiences at the time? What was going through your mind?
When the war ended?
No, during combat. I mean, was
well,
there any...
I've had mixed emotions and different answers for many of these things, and I never like to be brief about it, but I've been asked what was the worst part of the war for me. Mm-hmm. And the answer that comes to mind where I can answer that one, just being away from home. That was what had hit me. That, all I could think of was home, home, home. But there were so many experiences, and I've thought about it and reflected on it. But it was on June the 13th, 1944. That was a week after the invasion. It was the worst day I had the entire war. And the artillery shells never started coming in, never stopped. The mortars were endless. Actually, they always tell you, the one that killed you, you're not going to hear it. And I didn't hear it. It blew me right off the road. I heard it explode, but it never hit me, and put me right in the ditch. And this was a place that they have nicknamed or called Bloody Gulch, which is outside of Carentan. Mm-hmm. And as the day progressed, and it seemed to never end, I was with one of our men, and he started crying, calling for his mother. And he was a man that had not been an original Toccoa man and trained with us from day one. And I don't know whatever happened to him. I remember yelling medic, and the miracle of it was if you yelled for medic, they were there. You don't know where they were or what they were doing, but yell medic, and you always found one. And he arrived and took this fellow away, and I never saw or heard from him again. And then as the day progressed, I was with a group where I was trying to mention earlier that the battalion headquarters is usually a group of about 10 people. People that cater to the colonel. There's the S3, the S2, and the hangers-on, but there's a group that is called the battalion command. And I was with them, and it's the first time I'd ever seen anybody in our organization ever back up, or I'd hate to use the word retreat, but it was on a curve.
Advance in another direction.
Sorry?
Advance in another direction.
That's right. Strategic withdrawal to the rear. But it was on a curve on the road, and they had gone around the curve to get away from what was happening. And I remember lying on the ground and pulling grass out from underneath my face, hoping I could get my head just a little bit lower. And that was June the 13th. And the amazing thing was, I was 2nd Battalion, and I was part of this reenacting group. And when they asked me, I told them that story. And they had a fellow by the name of Ed Shames, who was with the 3rd Battalion. And they asked him what was the worst day, because he had gone from D-Day to Berchtesgaden, the same as myself. And June the 13th was the worst day he ever had. And because of the actions he took place in or was part of, on that day, he ended up getting a battlefield commission. But it was a bad day, and I know Ed explains that he thought if they ever broke through, they'd get down to Omaha or Utah Beach. It was just a bad day.
So backtracking a little bit from the 13th, when you jumped on D-Day,
yeah,
on the 6th, what was your baptism of fire like? I mean,
well, I really and truly had a marvelous D-Day as far as others when I think of the horror that took place in some of the areas. But the program was that we came around and we were going to fly over 2 little islands, I think it was. I can't think of the names of them right now. And there was going to be an indication from some source on the ground that was the line that we should be on. And when we hit French soil, the program was stand up and hook up. The red light came on. And I remember saying to Captain Hester, because it was very vivid, What a surprise. I thought that something would happen, the shells would come up, and there was not an enemy fire of any sort. And as I stood up and could see down and see the ground, there was no fire coming up. And very shortly thereafter, and this is something that Hollywood did very well in this piece of the Band of Brothers, we ran into a cloud cover. And it was amazing. Right as soon as we got into the cloud cover, the planes were up and down and left and right. It was a very, very rough, tough ride. I'd never been in a situation like that before, and I had no idea what was causing it. And that went on for a minute or so. And you have to realize that flight time over the Cherbourg Peninsula is only 11 minutes. So here they got 12,000 men in this armada that they, with 11 minutes of flight time, they've got to spread them all over that part of that peninsula. And as soon as we broke out of the cloud cover, I can remember shortly thereof, seconds later, I saw one plane blow into a ball of fire. It was just like Hollywood might have done it. It was just, oh, yeah. And seconds later, I saw another plane that was in flames going down. And all I could think of was, dear Lord, let me out of this plane. Those men never had a chance. You know, put on the green light, let me out. And of course, as I say, the flight time was 11 minutes, and I have no idea how much time, but it seemed like eternity being up there. And green light went on, and I think Captain Hester and myself and Otto Sykes were all one body coming out of that aeroplane. And as I said, there's nobody else that we know of who was in that aeroplane. And we landed very close together. I bet we hadn't been 150, 200 feet apart when the three of us had landed. And Otto and I were in an apple orchard, and Captain Hester was just out of the apple orchard. And Otto managed to help me out of my chute. He hadn't gotten out of it. He had gotten out of his, and he picked me, found me, and helped me get out of mine. And he said Captain Hester was just ahead of us. So he said he found Captain Hester had a light with him that he could have put up in a tree. And he was trying to find somebody, and some strange soldier, whatever, had arrived, and because they were dropping in all directions, had this fellow climb a tree and put this little light up in the tree. And it has been written up in several books that we had that night the largest assembly of airborne men in Normandy that night. The numbers range from 175 to more than 200 men in one accumulated group. The firing, or the enemy fire then, was it was in the distance. Didn't sound like any of the American guns. They learned that you could learn the difference of the sound of each gun, and it seemed to be away. It wasn't close or threatening. And the group kept getting bigger, and Lieutenant Nixon arrived on the scene. And Lieutenant Nixon has been well known through the Band of Brothers, and he had been a man that I guess was $1 a year man. Nixon, New Jersey is named after his family, and he was S2. And Captain Hester said, Nick, you speak good French. Find a farmhouse and find out where we are. We have no idea. There's nothing familiar here, and we don't even know what direction to start off on. And we were on we were on a dirt road. It was just a small dirt road that we were on, quite narrow, like a farmer's trail that he had through. So we sent Nixon off, and this is probably sometime, I know I landed at 1:20. That I remember that vividly. This had to be sometime after 2 o'clock. So off Nixon disappeared. And he was gone, and he was gone, and he was gone. In the meantime, this group is growing. People are coming in, men from the 82nd Airborne, men from the other battalions, and it was a very mixed group of men that were all in one big group there in this little roadway we were on, dirt road, no Nixon. And Hester said, we've waited long enough. We can't wait any longer. This is ridiculous. We've got to go somewhere. We can't stand in one big group. And the thought that always came through my mind in situations like that, because we've been taught so vividly, don't group up. spread out, one shell will get you all. And that was, you know, the holler and the cry that was always on. Spread out, one shell will get everybody. And Captain Hester said, well, we can't wait any longer. Let's go this way. There was only 2 directions we could go. And we had just started to move. We hadn't gone 100 feet. And Nixon showed up. So they went into quite an argument between the 2 of them. As, where have you been? You've been gone for a couple of hours, and you know, what's this all about? And we're standing here waiting, and they were quite boisterous about their excitement over what had happened and why hadn't you showed up. Nixon says, well, I found a farmhouse, and I knocked on the door, and the farmer answered, and he invited me in. I spoke good French, and he invited me in. And we sat down at the table, and he put a bottle of wine on the table. And so he said, I had to be polite. This is the words from Captain Hester telling me that. I've got some of his handwriting about this story. And he said, so I had to be polite, and I sat there, and we enjoyed having a drink and telling us where we are. But we're going the wrong direction. We have to go that way, not the direction that Hester had started. So that was the beginning of it, and we moved out, and we hadn't gone very far, and we got on a road that had been completely obliterated by our English or American bombs. The road you didn't even see it. You knew eventually it had been the highway, the road, it was the way it was lined up, and we were walking along on it, but nothing but potholes. And I remember the break of dawn it was, and I looked around, and there wasn't a leaf on a tree. And the only thing that came to my mind at that particular time was, this is World War I. This is no man's land. I've never, anything like this. The 6th of June in Normandy, and no leaves on a tree. This is horrible. But I've learned as the years went on, this is where some of the coastal guns that the Germans had was very close to that area. And they had bombed it intensely. And as we moved along, I can remember at that particular time, Major Horton was our executive officer of our battalion. He was just ahead of me. And we were just moving slowly and stop and go. He saw a dead German lying off to the side, and there was a small motorbike that I guess he was a courier, and that was off to the side. He'd been blown off the road, I guess. And Major Horton looked back at me. He said, Falvey, stick him. See if he's dead. And I looked up and I smiled. I said, Major Horton, you know he's dead. I think he wanted to get my reaction to, what he said and seeing a dead German for the first time, because that was the first dead German I had seen. And I don't know, maybe he was trying to break the ice and make us feel better about what we were up to. And the group, we were on both sides of what had been a road and spread out, and it was stop and go, and it was slow moving, and the day progressed, and the only instance where I actually fired my gun that day, and not at anybody, but for covering fire, someone had discovered an 88 down off the road, and I don't know what officer put this all together. He said, but I want about 6, 8, 10 of you fellas to go down along that hedgerow and get down to where the gun is. He said, but don't stay on this side of the hedgerow, because there's nothing down there but an open field. And he said, one of our men is going to come down and follow down with him, and he's going to go over the hedgerow, and when you fellas start firing, give him cover fire, he's going to run up and put a grenade down the barrel. This was all programmed, and so we got down and we reached the point where we saw the gun, and we were going to start firing high. And the name won't come to me, but it will before I finish today, where he jumped over the hedgerow, ran up and put a grenade down the barrel. We turned around and went back to the highway and proceeded on. And that was my main action, actually, for the day. Very, a wonderful day for me and the men that I was with, but it wasn't a horror of D-Day.
So that was D-Day, but what was a typical day like? How did a typical day go when you guys were on the front lines?
Well, that was something that, you know, it's hard to even explain, because the communication men, as a rule, they were a part of the battalion headquarters, and they were never actually what we would call the front line. The front line might be 100 yards out in front of you, but you were back, you weren't there. And so I had men fellas that were machine gunners and everything else, when they'd come back in and they'd say, oh God, it's hell out there, it's awful. And the highway leading to Carrington, where there were the bridges, and they were getting, well, between the mortars coming in and some of the German planes were coming over and trying to bomb these bridges. It was a real hell, and this was a long, straight highway that went from St. Côme-de-Mont to Carrington. And that is the road where they had the first bayonet charge. I think Colonel Cole was part of that. But being on the front line is, I wasn't there with the men that what do you call them, the riflemen of a line company. It was different. But D-Day +1, we left Saint Marie du Mont, and we went into a little place that name won't come to me right now. And there was a small E Company was out ahead of us, and I think we were with D Company, and we were just marching down the road. And a small arms fire started. The bullets started coming over the hedgerow, and some of our men gave them return fire, and it kept growing. Well, it turned out, as the day progressed, somebody called and got 2 tanks that showed up, and those tanks laid their 80-75s on the hedgerow, and their 50 calibers, and they just fired and swept the area out there beyond where we were on the other side of the hedgerow. And I've got written proof of it, that that day, this was the 6th Parachute Regiment of the Germans, and they had gotten their backs to a swamp. They couldn't retreat, and they couldn't back up. And between our 2 tanks with the 50 caliber fire and firing the 75s, the white flags finally went up. And I remember going back in, and there was guys with white flags, and nothing you could do with them. Just they gathered them up eventually, and different men were, I guess, put on them, and they marched them out. But the story is, and I don't know how the fact is, but it's close. There was 125 dead and 125 captured, and that was the 6th Parachute Regiment of the Germans. And that was, and we lost 1 man that day. His name was Stoney. He was part of our S2. Well, that was, and it's never been, I've never seen it written up. I've never heard any stories about it, but I have a diary here that, where the company clerk had recorded it, that that's what happened that day. And so I remember it vividly.
When you transferred to the bazookas, what was a typical day like? Was that a little more?
You never knew. You never knew what was going to happen. I mean, it's and we never had any real training. I don't think any of the crew had ever even fired the gun. And we went into Holland as a whole brand new crew, and the word went out, bazookas up front, bazookas up front. That became a matter of fact, I wrote a little story about bazookas up front. And one of the first things that happened, we were heading towards the bridge at Zahn, and the name, oh good grief, names, I'm having a terrible time with names. It'll come. This was down the main street in Zahn, and they discovered this 88 right in the middle of the road, leading toward the bridge that we had to supposedly secure and capture. And a fellow by the name of Lindsay fired the bazooka, and I wasn't there with him. I was with a different squad that day, and he hit him dead on. Destroyed the man that was there and the gun, and that was a saving grace at that particular moment for that particular gun. At that particular time, I was with a squad that was coming running through the backyards of the houses in Zahn to get to the bridge, and I was probably 150, 200 feet at the most from the bridge, and I got hit with a ricochet bullet, and I actually have the bullet, and it knocked me right on my rear end, dropped me. And oh boy, I'm wounded, but I'm all right, fellas. Keep going, I'll be okay. And I'm putting my hand down on down here, right my crotch, and after I rubbed a while, I'm looking for blood, no blood. And I started to move my leg. I could move my leg, so I was able to stand up and get along. I moved. I had a hole in my jacket pocket, and it was like 2 days later. I was looking for something in my pocket, and I found the bullet. It was a ricochet bullet. It's bent. It hit the corner of a house, I guess, and come down and hit me. But I was sure that I had been wounded, and going to be maybe out of combat completely. But that only lasted a few minutes, and then I got up to. I can't even tell you exactly how close, but I was right close to that bridge when it blew up. I remember seeing the parts fly into the air. And the question was, we often thought over the years, why didn't they drop us on that bridge? We could have saved it. But, as time went on, we realized that we were expendable. And when you have an objective such as that, men's lives didn't mean that much. You had to capture that objective, and we didn't. And that sort of held things up for almost 24 hours with the British trying to get to the Arnhem for the bridge that was too far.
So you could describe a typical day with the bazookas as kind of chaotic and hectic. The bazookas.
Well, it was always bazookas up front. Bazookas up front, and you'd get up there and there was nothing to fire at. They hadn't found anything. But one particular day we had trying to capture some little town up there in Holland, and two of these fellas, and most of this bazooka squad were men that had come in as replacements after Normandy.
Okay.
And these two young fellas, it was usually two men with a gun and one man carrying the ammunition. And I was close to them. And anyway, they had this half-track coming up the road, and wait. So finally they decided it was time to fire it, and we squeezed the trigger, and the man that was putting the shell in hadn't released the little clips that turned the shell loose, and it lifted him right out of the hole, pulled him right out of the ditch he was in, and the shell it never fired. It just all the explosion and the force of the bazooka shell actually lifted him right out of the ditch that they were in. And the German half-track turned, and they went the other way. And I remember these two guys that were manning that gun thought it was a big joke. So these are the recruits that we had that came in after D-Day. They were a good bunch. They were a good bunch, but they didn't want to dig foxholes, and they acted completely different than the men that had trained in Toccoa. They hadn't had the training that we had in Toccoa. A good gang. Then there was, up in Veckel, New York, there was one of the bazooka men actually, it was the worst day for 2nd Battalion in the Holland invasion. And this was in, the names won't come to me right now. Could be Veckel. And it was the Germans were trying to break through this highway that we were trying to open up and keep protected. And one of the men managed to take out a tank in Veckel. And that's documented in one of George Katsukamaki's book. And, he was a great guy, this Lindsay, just a young fellow that never wanted to obey orders and do what he wanted to do, and actually was a real pain, but he was a good soldier. And this is where my charmed life and divine intervention has entered into it. 2 days before this thing that happened in Veckel, and the worst time that our battalion had in the whole invasion of Holland, and we were there for 72 days, the Colonel Strayer said, Falvey, get a bazooka squad, I'll give you a jeep, take you up to Oud, which was beyond Veckel. He says to protect that, he says there's a regular crossroads there where they might come in from 2 directions. protect that little spot right there. And then, okay, great, Colonel, thank you. So we jumped in the Jeep and he took us up and dumped us off, and then we had a man in this group in one of that corner and another group over here, and I was in a, well, like a farmyard with a barn door in front of me, or there, and this is what we were going to take care of. We were there for several days and nothing ever happened. We just stood there. And in the meantime, the battalion is having hell to happen to them down at Veckel. So this is, and I've read later that it was a good part of E Company that was up in Veckel, up in Uden at that time. And if that's been written up in some of these history books, where I think was Captain, well, it was the captain then, but Lieutenant Nixon and some of that group were in Veckel, in Uden. And I don't remember ever knowing they were there. I thought my group was the only ones in this little village of Uden. But this is where nothing ever happened with me, and the rest of the men got hell knocked out of them. Terrible. Oh dear, what's the man's name that I didn't care for that wrote a book?
Webster?
Webster. He's got quite an account of what took place in Veckel.
Yeah.
It was part of the horror that took place down there. And they finally broke through. Everything was good. And 24 hours later, the Germans broke through again, and we had to go down and open it up one more time. And not to just go on and on, but on going back, we went not down the road, but we went out into the fields. And Holland was like a billiard table. All the fields were so flat and great. And I can remember getting caught in the middle of a field with machine gun fire and rifle fire, and I dropped into a ditch, not a ditch, but a furrow in this farm field. And of all the foolish thoughts to come to your mind at a time like that, when the bullets are snapping right over the top of you, a thought came through my mind: if I ever survive this, I'm going to drink all the Tom Collinses I can ever put into me. Isn't that the most foolish thing to come? Unreal. But that's what went through my mind, and I've never forgotten it. But there I was out in the field, and finally the firing stopped, and I managed to get back, and one of the men said, "There's a Tiger tank out on the road." And we had a British tank that was supposedly operating with us. And he went to the tank commander, and he said, "There's a Tiger tank out there on that road. You can see him way out there. Maybe you better get him." And the reply from the British fellow, "Well, I've got to get orders from my commander before I can fire." Well, but before he fired, I guess the Tiger had picked him out. And the shell came in and blew the tank, and I can remember that tank just burned and burned, and somebody tried to come out of that turret and only got about halfway out, and he was cooked right there as far as he got. But that's pretty much the way the British operated. They didn't handle things on their own. They had to get orders for what they did. American soldier thought instinctively as to what to do.
So going off that armor story, how effective was your overall fire support?
How was the what?
Your fire support, how effective was it?
What do you mean by the fire support?
Like your other combat arms, the armor, the artillery, the Navy, the Air Force. How was that?
Well, that went on and on. And in Holland, at that particular time, we didn't have any artillery fire. It was strictly small combat areas and small arms fire that was being taken care of. And finally we moved up, and they put us into this area that's called the Island. And that was up beyond Nijmegen. And well, the British informed us that we were relieving them. They were taking care of the island. And that was this area just south of, before the bridge at Arnhem. And their expressions to us: don't bother them, and everything will be quiet. What do you mean, don't bother them? Well, if you don't shoot at them or bother them, they're not going to bother you. And that was the general opinion. They thought this was a very quiet area they were in, and we were relieving them. Well, being Americans, we don't do anything like that. We're in war, and we want to make war. And all hell broke loose right after we got to the island. and a place called, I think, Houston. That's where we lost, well, it was Colonel Horton at that time. He was killed, and one of my best friends was 3rd Battalion. He got wounded badly. Houston, I think even our buddy Webster was wounded up in that area. But all hell broke loose up there on that island, and we couldn't do it and do it quietly.
How would you characterize your overall combat performance from Normandy to Bastogne? What did you think of it? Did you think that it was top notch? Was it
my combat or the outfit's combat?
The outfit's combat. What did you think of it?
Well, I thought it was fantastic. It could depend. I mean, if there was anything had to be done, they went out and did it, and it was done. I don't remember anybody ever complaining or saying, we can't do it, or they're going to overwhelm us, or whatever. This was the American ingenuity taking place, and you realize that. And now up on there was a long dike that ran along that protected us from the river that was out there. And the Germans had one advantage, other than they had a disadvantage. On this dike, artillery couldn't hit us because of the trajectory. It would go over us and land beyond us. But when they were firing mortars, and we learned to hear them pop, pop going off, then we would count them when they landed. And a mortar could come right down on top of you because they came straight down. And one more time, I talk about divine intervention. I had a foxhole on that dike, and I wasn't any further from that than I was half the distance I am from me to you. And another fellow had a foxhole, and a mortar came in and hit him dead on. And I was covered with all parts of blood and body from that man that was eliminated with a mortar shell. But the mortars were a horror. You never knew which one was going to get you. And that was just prior to this part up there. I wasn't part of it, where some of our men of our battalion or our regiment brought some of the Canadians and English that had landed on the other side of the river and brought them back overnight, that were survivors that had managed to stay alive.
Now, did you have any instances of friendly fire in your unit?
Friendly fire?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was instances, and good grief, the word went out quick, and everybody's cursing and swearing. Tell those idiots back there that learn how to do what they're doing, and give them the right coordinates and whatever. But it wasn't anything that was something I had in my memory that I remember distinctly of the times. But yeah, every once in a while there'd be a friendly fire shell come in, and there would be a big noise made immediately. Cut it out. And the most wonderful thing that nobody ever talks about in Holland, and this came late during the mission, we had what we called artificial moonlight. And Ed James is the only man that I've ever spoken to that remembers or has discussed artificial moonlight. Somewhere way back, miles behind us, we had big batteries of searchlights. They would turn on right as soon as we had darkness. And they would shine in our direction up front. And you could look out, you turn around, you couldn't see anything move behind you. But if you looked out front, you could see anything that might move. It was unbelievable. It was worth its weight in gold. And have you ever heard about artificial moonlight?
No.
Well, when you do any other interviews or talk with any other people, ask them about artificial moonlight. These are men that had been in Holland, up in that area, because that's the only time I remember ever seeing it. But what a relief! All night, those lights would be on, and you could just look out and you could see anything move.
Now, we're talking about friendly fire. Did you have any experiences of shell shock, the PTSD? Was that a common occurrence in your unit?
No, I'm not understanding it.
Shell shock, a post-traumatic stress disorder, where the soldier it's a mental breakdown.
Men that had lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was one of our men in Normandy, and this happened during this time of Bloody Gulch, around the 13th. He had disappeared. He had no idea what happened or where he went. And we finally ended up in reserve or not in any particular combat position in Carrington. And we looked up one day, and here came our buddy. He's wearing a great big Prussian helmet with a church steeple sticking out the top. You know, you've seen these in some of these pictures, with a great big grin on his face. And where he had been and what he had done, we had no idea. So, how are you, buddy? And a big old smile. And we called the medics, and that's the last we ever saw of him. They just took him away. And so I understand he stayed in Europe and became an ambulance driver. But he left our regiment. And the other thing that I didn't bring up was right after we left, after Normandy, the word came out that from now on we were all going to be the same. We were going to look the same as the infantrymen. We were going to wear the same kind of jackets, the same kind of pants. We were going to wear the same shoes. We couldn't wear the airborne boots anymore. We felt we were a step ahead or a step beyond, and the word had come out that we can't do that anymore. We're all going to look the same, and no more boots, no more jumpsuits, and we didn't like that one bit. We thought we were something a little bit special, but that was the uniform. From then on, everybody would look alike.
Now, did you follow that, or did you keep the boots? I know there are some stories of some soldiers not trading in the jump boots and
that was
kept
a
wearing
headache.
those.
That was a headache. Being a sergeant in a platoon, that was part of the thing before we were going to go into combat or go up to Holland. Make sure everybody has the right equipment. Mm-hmm. And you'd issue shoes one day, and the fellows would say, "Well, somebody stole them, Sergeant. Don't hand me that." You know, and I'd get them another pair of shoes. And we had born and raised in airborne. The boots were our name. This was us. And to be told that we can't wear them anymore, it was against the grain. But it took time, but it finally settled in. This was it. This was it. You had to wear the same clothing that all the rest of the troops did.
All right, well, I think we'll take a little bit of a break there.
Good.